Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm seeing arrivals in the participants. Thanks everyone for taking the time to listen. Thank you to New York Textile Month for sharing space with me during this busy New York Textile Month with lots going on. So thank you for sharing space for me to share about my work. Please feel free to add comments or questions in the chat. And I'm gonna go ahead and begin. At the time of this talk, my life is not still. It is very active. I'm now back to commuting to New York City a few days a week to teach at FIT and Parsons School of Design from my home in upstate New York. Art spaces are opening in-person shows again, holding opening receptions that you don't want to miss. And studio visits are resuming in person, and in the Hudson Valley, that means driving great distances for conversation and viewing art in real life again. The feeling of needing to be in many places at once. As I'm whirling in all of this movement, all good movement, I might add, I'm resistant to move too fast. I remember working on this piece in my studio back in March 2020, the first piece I made after we were all told not to come back to campus, and that the exhibition I had just installed would only be viewed online. When I posted this piece on Instagram many months later, someone commented, "What a joyous piece for such a sad, dark time." And amidst all the horror and anxiety, truth be told, I did feel joy. The joy of long, uninterrupted days in the studio. I want to stop here and acknowledge that I do not have children, and so I did not have the sudden, onerous, heroic task of caring for them at home while working. I did have the enormous responsibility of transitioning 4 college fine arts courses online, but I performed that with a very light touch, allowing everyone involved to adjust and find safety. When the world stopped, as devastating and terrifying as it was, and brought tremendous fear about death and the future, I found peace in the slowness and stillness. With the world upside down, it was a tremendous relief for me to stay home, to go into the studio, work with physical, tactile matter, to create beautiful things. It felt like the healthiest thing to do. I began to practice yoga and meditation more regularly and take long walks with my dog on the trails around my house. I became more acutely aware of my body and my energy. And naturally, my physical relationship to my work expanded beyond assembling and wrapping found objects to how I move around them in the space, how I move them around in the space. And discovered that time and sound and words are another layer to my communication as a visual artist. I started to document my actions, these kind of time-based experimentations. Never in a million years did I ever think I would place myself in front of a video camera. But stillness and presence and paying attention, experiencing my work at a different, slower speed. I'll talk about this work a little bit more in a bit. Fellow graduate student, while in Hunter College's MFA program between 2004 and 2007, said that I needed to always be ready with a new body of work for when a gallery would come knocking and want to see in my studio a solo show. Be this good advice or not, I lived by it for many years after graduating, always pumping out new work, new work, new work, new work, more new work. The ethos, hard work pays off, suits a workaholic like me. And like many of us in various ways, feeding a capitalist society that's obsessed with the new. After Hunter MFA, I continued to make sculpture, large sculpture, which is both challenging to show and challenging to sell. I found many different jobs to support myself and eventually settled on teaching as the most synergistic of all the jobs to the job of making art. But I had to work fast. And in the bits and spurts of studio time, I guarded each week with my life. Out of necessity, I developed a way of working that was both fast, impulsive, using what was readily available around me, but also slow, a kind of necessary pocket of time each week for meditative, repetitive action. Fast forward, each day in lockdown felt long and generous, full of expansive space. My body relaxed, my work slowed down. I didn't have to be anywhere. Out of this time came a body of work I collectively call The Helpers, which was shown in January 2021 at a Chelsea, New York gallery called Hasflado. The title of the show, The Helpers, came to me while I was working on this body of work, these sculptures as characters, and realizing that each one of them is somehow engaged in either tending to the earth, tending to others, or tending to their own inner lives. And these pieces are all made out of found objects and repurposed textiles. And I'm going to talk about each one. Starting with this one is called the Confidant. And the Confidant is the wise friend, seated upright, paying attention, listening, seated in lotus pose. This one is called the Griever, and it began with this idea of 3 upside down bowls, which represent loss. And there's a vintage glass bowl in the center that I found at a thrift store. Also, this idea of a kind of old fashioned or retro idea of public grieving, wearing all black. It's wrapped in a velvet fabric with some pink satin material, like flesh showing through the mourning dress, with a pillbox hat that you see here as a kind of comic relief for a piece that's quite, with the radish on top, a piece that's quite melancholy. And it was an important piece within the group, and was situated between, the Confidant and this next piece, which is more of an optimistic piece. Called New Day. And New Day is made from a chain link fence that my neighbor was throwing out, and I wrapped it in repurposed textiles, in the palette of a Frederick Church, who is a Hudson River School painter, from one of his sunrise paintings called Looking East Over the Hudson Valley from the Catskill Mountains. And it spells out New Day, so the density or buildup of material on one side, it's vertically spells New Day. I think of this piece as a kind of marker for where I live and work geographically in the Hudson Valley. This piece is called The Joiner, and the joiner is an occupation, and the joiner is, a woodworker, and their objective is to, work with this natural living material, wood, and combine separate pieces so that it's both building strength and flexibility. And this piece does not involve any kind of actual woodworking joinery or even wood. It's found objects in repurposed textiles, but I thought that was really poetic, this kind of simultaneous strength and flexibility. And the overall form is a butterfly, specifically a swallowtail butterfly, which represents, among many things, spiritual rebirth. And this next piece is called The Caretaker. And I went back and forth on calling it caregiver or caretaker. And I thought it was interesting that give and take are sort of interchangeable words for an occupation that kind of is similar, means the same thing. A caretaker is someone who's more often thought about as caring for an inanimate things. And I don't think, such as property, for example, and I don't think of things as inanimate. So I went with caretaker, but the piece was the material that is the kind of base material, fabric material is mask scraps. So there was a coalition of 600 some people near where I live who, at the onset of the pandemic, sewed masks for healthcare workers and underserved communities. And someone from the group reached out and offered a donation of scraps from the masks. And I felt like that material was really charged. And so that kind of sparked the idea of the piece. Also, my nephew's kind of rough drawing of a Red Cross. But thinking about also in terms of caretaking, that there's, it sort of parallels what I do in terms of the rehabilitation of discarded material. This is the digger. It takes the form of both an excavator and a question mark. And I think of this one as a kind of self-portrait in the group. During this time, taking a really deep dive into, where I am in my life personally, spiritually, professionally, what direction I want to move in, what's working in my life, what opportunities are opening up, what's not working, what communities are supportive, what am I gravitating towards, what do I want to engage with professionally, with teaching, what kinds of environments I want to be in, how will I support myself financially, how do I want to be of service to others? Lots of questions. And this last piece in the show is The Gardener, and it was actually made in 2019, so it wasn't made along with the others, which were sort of made all together, but I liked its inclusion with the group as a kind of tending to the earth, the gardener, planting seeds in order to cultivate growth. So what do my materials mean to me? Using found objects, I think of them as like armatures or skeletons. It's about using what's readily available. I like the idea of the embedded carbon in the thing that already exists. They were already consumed and discarded. There's a rehabilitation, saving them from the landfills, the hunting, the finding, the salvaging, the transformation, seeing the formal potential in the shapes and the lines, like found drawings in my immediate environment. The skin on the skeleton is of repurposed textiles. And textiles brings history, it brings intimacy, it brings softness. It's an ancient technology that through time has propelled how we understand tradition, how we understand technology today, technology of the future. Textile brings culture, politics. It's sexy, it's abject, it disguises, it reveals. But I didn't start out using found objects and textiles. I studied painting. And for me, using fabric became a replacement for paint. I studied traditional painting, a discipline with a very narrow history, a straight line like an arrow, an adopted inheritance full of privilege and masculinity. Cutting up old soft things, roughly stitching them together and hanging them on the wall, demanding attention like painting, was freeing. It was a very rebellious act for a young artist. There was a lot that happened between the image that I just showed you of the painting and this work here. And in a very short amount of time, I was experimenting with painting on different surfaces and collaging different surfaces and trying to figure out what my subject matter for my paintings would be. And then I cut up this old suitcase, I hung it on the wall, and it was a moment that changed the course of how I work to this day. What I discovered is that I didn't need I was intending to paint on the suitcase, but discovered that I didn't need to, that there was a truth to the material, the physicality of it, the relationship to the body, how it hung on the wall. It satisfied my desire to find an alternative approach to painting that deals with the stuff of daily life. And looking back now, I see it as an early impulse to be both ecologically conscientious and also feminist, because it sort of replaced painting a painted hand with sewing. I continued to use repurposed textiles as a primary materials for making sculptural assemblages through the rest of my studies as a BFA painting major, and then into Hunter MFA in sculpture. But I knew little of the history of fiber art, and therefore, sort of after graduating, had to kind of sort of educate myself in a way. I struggled to understand my own relationship to it. And these books really helped kind of open a door to theoretical, historical, ethnological understanding of the process and materials that I was using. So on the left, Gillian Adamson's Thinking Through Craft as an Idea, Elisa Author's providing context for the divide between art and craft, and then Richard Sennett's craft in terms of the innate desire of humans to do something well. In 2016, I began making work more freestanding, so liberating it from the wall. They became active figures, surrogates, archetypical characters that, with titles that suggest their roles, occupational roles, their social roles. I keep a list of titles, and the process of adding to the list is not unlike the process of collecting materials, hunting, gathering, saving for a later use. On the left is kind of the working list of pieces that I haven't made yet, and on the right is kind of keeping a little track of the ones that I have. Sometimes I start with a title and I'm looking for materials that's approximate the idea that I have in my head for what form the character would take. Other times I find materials and that sparks an idea for a character. Drawing is something that I do quite a lot, and it serves as a key to the making of these sculptures. It's not a one-to-one planning out what I'm going to make. I see drawing more as a kind of two-dimensional home base for working intuitively in 3 dimensions. But sometimes I begin with a sketch. Other times it's in the middle of a piece, I'll sketch when I feel like I've gotten lost and I need to get back to the original sort of intention of the piece. An idea could be sparked by a very simple doodle. There's a few more examples of drawings in relation to the sculptures. And also kind of moving forward in time, 2019. And here's just a few more sculptures between then and now to share with you. The base of this piece is something from a refrigerator that a friend of mine found on the side of the road and brought it to me. She said, "I think you could use this." She wasn't wrong. Thanks, Sarah. I'm often asked where I get my materials. And for 15 years, I lived in a 122 unit apartment building in Brooklyn. This is the building on the left. And a lot of my materials came from the basement, what people were throwing out. And then in 2016, I moved to Dutchess County, about an hour and, well, 80 miles north of this building. And so I get a lot of stuff at the local dump and yard sales. So where we live now, 3 acres, trees, grass, a house that needed a tremendous amount of repair, but it's quiet. Here I live more connected to the land, which I want to acknowledge was originally inhabited by the Wappinger, Pocasset, and Munsee Lenape nations. Here, my husband, the artist and musician Colin O'Con, and I have collaborated on building lives centered on art making. Here, I am compelled to share the land, and for 3 years, we have invited artists to experiment with their work outdoors, and thus a backyard art space called White Rock Center for Sculptural Arts, and a little plug here for this panel discussion that's going to happen on Thursday night as part of New York Textile Month's September programming. The show this year is themed textiles. But in addition to working in my studio and making my work, building community is really important. And I do that in a number of ways through the backyard art space and through curating at other spaces. On the left is a show that, a 40-person show that I curated called Drawing for Sculpture at an artist-run space in Bushwick, New York, called Tiger Strikes Asteroid. And on the right is a more recent activity that I was a part of, River Valley Arts Collective, and I served as a artist in residence in community research, and building a kind of registry of artists in visual artists in the Hudson Valley region. This is the last, no, I take that back. This is an example of my own experimentation of bringing my work outside. And I showed it during our inaugural backyard art show. It spells out the word listen, and it's made from repurposed rope and some found objects. And I have been, since making this, I had wanted to create another rope banner in a public space and have it be more interactive and more of like a community art project. I've been wanting to bring that into my work. So just this past week, I installed another rope banner at the Newburgh, New York Free Library as part of an exhibition called Terrain Biennial Newburgh. And I did invite people to help me in the creation of the piece. And it was really fun that the gentleman on the right was there for 3 hours. He was really into it. Just kind of the weaving and participating in the building of it. And it's going to be there until November. So the last few images I'm going to show you are more, there are a few more of the kind of time-based experiments that have come out of this last 2 years, a year and a half. And so I'll play those for you. And this last one, I'm gonna end here with the words of a poet, Mary Oliver. I discovered this poem after I had made this piece, and it's called "The Gardener." By Mary Oliver. By Mary Oliver. Have I lived enough? Have I loved enough? Have I considered right action enough? Have I come to any conclusion? Have I experienced happiness with sufficient grace? I say this, or perhaps I'm just thinking it. Actually, I probably think too much. Then I step out into the garden, where the gardener, who's said to be a simple man, is tending to his children, the roses. So thank you again. Thank you for listening. I would love to hear any questions or comments, and please keep in touch.
Can you see the chat, Courtney?
I do. I see there's someone who said that these are beautiful and very inspiring. I appreciate your thoughtfulness of each piece and the materials used. Very thankful for this talk. Thankful for you joining, Eliza.
This was so great to see you present your work, Courtney. Thank you so much. It would be, is there anyone who has questions to Courtney?
Thank you. Thank you all so much. And again,
There is one question, Courtney. There is one question. Have you ever thought about making art piece to wear?
That is something I have been thinking more and more about, for sure. Yes. That's the simple answer. I have in some of the experiments that you haven't seen or that I haven't shown you is sort of trying things on and seeing how the body could, like fit. There's, they are a lot like drawing in space. So there's a lot of open spaces for like a head or arms or legs to fit through. So I think that it would, it's interesting because even with this other newer element of sound and movement, does it change how I construct the piece, from the get-go? And so I think that would be something that would likely need to happen, but in such a way that doesn't feel like it's restricting the kind of boundlessness of being able to draw in space with the material.
You have 2 more comments in the chat, Courtney, from Rebecca and Elko.
Rebecca says, I love seeing what is underneath. I know how long it takes to wrap the pieces and see the behind the scenes is really amazing. Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, sometimes in the piece, I know it's hard to really share on a screen, especially as it's like through a Zoom filter, some of the details in the work, but often, I'll sort of take the piece as far as I feel like it needs to go. And sometimes the underneath part doesn't always get completely covered. But it is a kind of play with the identifying of what those things are. Sometimes people want to know what those things are, and sometimes the obscuring of the thing allows our imagination to activate more. So there's definitely a play with those kind of identifiers. Oh, hi. Thank you for your talk. 2 questions. When the transition from painting to suitcase inner cloth sculpture, was there an urge to do it for a long time and finally came out, or do you have an aha moment? I think that it felt so instinctual and so natural to do that. And something I also identify and talk about a lot is that I grew up, my mother's an interior designer. And so I grew up in a house that was always like, there's a lot of fabric, and textiles around. And so and I was always really interested in fashion, still am. So it did feel very natural. I think it was about crossing, it sort of letting go of the sort of hierarchy of paint. And yeah, it's also like I think it was a battle with that sort of hierarchy of paint. And it just felt so right. And it was like, I talk about it as like a very dramatic moment of like not painting it and finally letting go of that. But it kind of was, and it definitely changed the course of my work. So do you alter found objects or use it as they are? It's a good question too. I primarily use them as they are, and find ways of connecting them. There's not a whole lot of breaking, of like a kind of more disassembling of the things. There's more assembling. But that's an interesting question, because what are the possibilities with if I were to spend more time disassembling things, what would happen then? Eiko, thank you. Nice, and thank you for coming. Nice to see you. Let's see, there's a new message. what are the bins in your studio so organized? Are they textiles like clothing, or is it pre-processed and ready to use? So the bins in the studio that you saw the video of are, you know, my palette, and it's stuff that people give me, stuff I'm no longer using, stuff that I find, and it's all kinds of stuff. There's string, there's rope, there's clothing, there's bed sheets. Wash everything first, put them in the bin, and yeah, so that it is ready to use. And I don't really have, I don't really have a preference necessarily in terms of textiles, you know, cotton versus linen versus wool versus, I'm really looking at, I mean, it depends on the piece, but like the texture and the color. So it's kind of all, it's all, what am I trying to say? Like it could all be used at any moment. I don't discriminate. Do you share your experience of the collaboration with ballet? I'm interested in. Thank you. No ballet. I ballet when I was little, but I did collaborate with Brenda Neville Dance Studio with Counterpointe, which is part of Norte Maar, an organization in Brooklyn where they pair a sculptor with a choreographer. And in that project, some of my flat, I do have a series of work where they're flat fabric panels. And so that was a collaboration with those, but I would, you know, I would welcome more opportunities to collaborate with dance and movement. Let's see. All right. Well, thank you everyone again so much for coming, and again for allowing me the space to share.